The world is continuing to mourn the death of former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan, who died on Saturday, August 18th at 80 years old after a short illness. A statement released by the United Nations said, quote, "We mourn the loss of a great man, a leader and a visionary, a life well lived, a life worth celebrating." Born in Ghana, Annan was the first black African to head the United Nations, serving as its leader from 1997 to 2006. As Secretary General, Annan was instrumental in creating the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Kofi Annan is also credited for saving Kenya from joining a list of failed states in Africa, after he mediated the peace talks which ended the post-election violence following the disputed and discredited December 27, 2007 elections in Kenya. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
Thanks, Paul, for that report. And joining us today are two distinguished guests, Dr. Daniel Kauma, Chairman of the Uganda Diaspora Investment Company, USA, and Jeffrey Smith, Executive Director, Vanguard Africa, a pro-democracy NGO that advocates for free and fair elections and respect for fundamental human rights in Africa. We also invited Ambassador Mar Sebuja Katende, the head of the Ugandan mission to the United States, but due to a scheduling conflict, he was not able to join us. Well, I have to say frankly that I am profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host you in Washington for the first time on Straight Talk Africa.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
You're most welcome. And we are joining us from New York is Stephane Dujarric, former spokesman for UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, and now a current UN spokesperson. He joins us, of course, from the UN headquarters in Manhattan. Good afternoon, Stephane.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
Very well, thank you. It's great to be on your show.
It's a pleasure to host you for the first time on Straight Talk Africa, Stephane. Stephane, you worked for the late UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. What kind of person was Kofi Annan, very, very briefly?
Personally, to me, he was a wonderful boss. He was a profoundly good man. I think I speak for a lot of current UN staffers and former UN staffers who say we had real pride in working for him as Secretary General. I think one of the legacies that he will leave is how he opened the United Nations up to voices, to civil society, to the business community, to people whose voices had not been heard within the halls of the United Nations. And he truly brought this organization into the 21st century.
How do you respond to some critics who say that he actually was able to get that job precisely, these are their words, not mine, precisely because he really was a very malleable individual, that he was very, very different from the man he succeeded, Dr. Boutros Ghali?
Look, every Secretary General is different. They are elected first and foremost by the Security Council, which goes, the 5 permanent members can veto them, and then the General Assembly. So that's just a fact. I think, during his 10 years, he suffered from criticism from different sides. Some people accused him of being too passive. Others accused him of being too active. I think you just need to take a look at the press coverage at the beginning, the middle, and the end of his term. The point is that any Secretary General has to navigate the will and the needs of 193 member states, and that's always a challenge. Kofi Annan used to joke that Secretary General SG, as he is called, really stands for scapegoat. And he went with it. And I think the one thing he never gave up on is trying to implement the ideals that are found in the Charter of the United Nations.
There's a saying, of course, that as a UN Secretary General, there are times when you may have to act as a secretary, and there are other times when it might be necessary for you to be a general. What kind of Secretary General was he? Was he the kind of guy that was a secretary or a general or a combination of both?
He was both. He did his job to the best of his ability. If you'll recall, in the run-up to the Iraq conflict, he did whatever he could to ensure that, to try to make sure that conflict would be avoided, that resolutions would be implemented. What he wanted was a respect for the international rule of law, a respect for the resolutions of the Security Council. We know what happened. He tried to defend the Charter. Some member states went ahead with the invasion of Iraq. But in the end, he didn't give up on the Iraqi people. He didn't walk away from the Iraqi people. After the bulk of the fighting was over, the United Nations returned to Iraq to help with the transition to democracy, to elections, and paying a very high price for it when 15 years ago last week, we lost 23 of our close comrades in a terrorist attack. I think, you know, he never gave up. And I think that's how we want to remember him, as a man who never gave up on this institution, which is meant to bring all 193 member states together, and which is never easy. It is one of the most impossible jobs on earth.
If you were to put your fingers on it, what would you say was perhaps the single most important decision that he made during his tenure? And what about the single most regrettable decision?
You know, I don't want to engage in that, because I think the decisions depend on, you know, on who they impact. And for all the people that have been impacted, those decisions are important. I think he led what was the first really review of the UN's actions in Srebrenica and in Rwanda. He was not afraid to have people cast a critical look on the organization to see how it could improve, how it could do better. I think one of the most, you know, a number of the important things he did was to usher in the Millennium Development Goals, the first time the international community came and to bring about a roadmap for development, to impact everybody on a positive side. The responsibility to protect was also passed under his mandate. And I think what your reporter mentioned in his report, how he brought the business community, the NGOs and member states together to fight the spread of AIDS. And I think that was it was a successful turnaround from where we were at the time.
You talked very much about reform, UN reform, the need for UN reform, especially the fact that when you look at the UN Security Council, it is not democratic. How far did he go in that direction?
Well, I think like most Secretaries General, he understood the need for the reform of the Security Council, for Security Council to be a reflection of the world that it is now as opposed to the world that it is in 1945. But the decision, the power to reform the Security Council rests in the hands of member states. It is not something that the Secretary General can order with the wave of a wand. It's a change in the Constitution, in the Charter of the United Nations, and that's something that member states need to do. But I think he understood that the legitimacy of the United Nations not only passed through reform of the Security Council, but also to make sure that everyone's voice was heard at the UN. And I think NGOs, civil society, for the first, you know, had a much greater voice thanks to the efforts that he put in, and that those efforts continue to pay off today.
Your current boss, the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, has described or characterized Kofi Annan as the UN, as the UN itself. What does that exactly mean?
Well, it means that, you know, for Kofi Annan, his entire just about his entire professional career was spent within the UN system. He was a product of the system. He understood the UN, and that's why he really embodied the UN when he was Secretary General. I mean, his professional career cannot be dissolved from the United Nations, and I think that's what Antonio Guterres meant when he said in many ways he was the United Nations when Mr. Guterres paid tribute to Mr. Annan after his death.
On that note, Stephane Dujarric, former spokesperson for UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, thank you so much for sharing that information with us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on the show.
You're most welcome, and of course, come again.
Will do. Take care.
Thank you. You too.